Over 30% of Republicans say violence may be necessary to save the United States from the threat of minorities. Researchers found that 30% of Republicans agreed with a statement because things have gotten so far off track. True American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. We'll be talking about who they are and how our government is going to protect us from domestic terrorism. Welcome to Radio Labio's English program, where I share the most interesting notes of the day that you may not have had time to catch up on. I'm Juan Andres. I podcast in English and Spanish to ensure that all Latinos can have access to our programs regardless of what language they speak, and thank you very much for listening. Among Americans who believe the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump, which was about 39%, believe violence may be required to save the United States. The troubling statistics show the post-election rancor that led to the violent insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th is still very much in place. Republicans are most likely to believe true American patriots may have to resort to violence. Researchers found out, with just 11% of Democrats and 17% of independents agreeing with the statement, among all Americans, 18% of total Americans think that we have to resort to violence to save the United States. 2,508 adults living in all 50 states were interviewed for the survey in September of this year. This poll illustrates a significant and rapidly increasing polarization in the country. As it's been some time from the January 6th episode, one might hope people would have calmed down by now. It looks like people are doubling down and views are getting locked in, inflexible. This poll is not the first to discover an apparent readiness for violence among Republican voters. More than 650 people have been criminally charged for their role in the Capitol attack, in which 5 people died. Trump is resisting attempts to investigate January 6th from a House Select Committee, most recently suing the National Archives to stop the release of White House documents. What is he hiding? How is the government of the United States going to protect the 82% of real patriots, in my opinion, from that 18% of unpatriotic Americans, in my opinion, who believe that violence is acceptable in resolving our differences or disagreements? Well, there is a plan, and I'm going to share it with you. This is directly from the White House and signed by President Joseph R. Biden Jr., entitled National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism. On his first full day in office, President Biden directed his national security team to lead a 100-day comprehensive review of U.S. government efforts to address domestic terrorism, which has evolved into the most urgent terrorism threat the United States faces today. As a result of that review, the Biden administration is releasing the first ever national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. Domestic terrorism is not a new threat in the United States, yet it is a threat Americans have endured too often in recent years. The comprehensive strategy provides a nationwide framework for the U.S. government and partners to understand and share domestic terrorism-related information, prevent domestic terrorism recruitment and mobilization to violence, disrupt and deter domestic terrorism activity, and confront long-term contributors to domestic terrorism. Our approach will protect both the nation and the civil liberties of its citizens. Under federal law, domestic terrorism is defined as activities that involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or any state, appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. The review was rooted in an expert assessment of the domestic terrorism threat provided by the intelligence and law enforcement communities. An unclassified summary of that assessment was released in March so that the public could see the key findings. It found that two most lethal elements of today's domestic terrorism threat are: one, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists who advocate for the superiority of the white race, and two, anti-government or anti-authority violent extremists such as militia violent extremists. To develop a government-wide strategy to counter domestic terrorists, the Biden administration consulted extensively with a wide array of experts across the United States government, as well as with leaders in Congress, state and local governments, academia, civil society, religious communities, and foreign governments. Throughout the process, we embraced the protection of civil rights and civil liberties as a national security imperative. The strategy we're releasing today is carefully tailored to address violence and reduce the factors that lead to violence, threaten public safety, and infringe on the free expression of ideas. It is organized around 4 pillars, the core elements of how the Biden administration will improve the U.S. government's response to this persistent, evolving, and lethal threat to our people, our democracy, and our national security. Pillar number 1, understand and share domestic terrorism-related information. The U.S. government will enhance domestic terrorism analysis and improve information sharing throughout law enforcement at the federal, state, local, tribe, and territorial levels, and where appropriate private sector partners are involved. The Department of Justice and Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, have implemented a robust system to methodically track domestic terrorism cases nationwide. The Department of State, as well as the intelligence and law enforcement communities, are learning more from foreign partners about the international dimensions of this threat. The Department of State will continue to assess whether additional foreign entities linked to domestic terrorism can be designed as foreign terrorist organizations or specifically designated global terrorists under relevant statutory criteria. The Department of the Treasury, in coordination with law enforcement, is exploring ways to enhance the identification and analysis of financial activity of domestic terrorists. The Department of Homeland Security, the DHS, is enhancing its analysis of open source information to identify threats earlier and will create a structured mechanism for receiving and sharing within government credible non-governmental analysis. Pillar number 2, prevent domestic terrorism recruitment and mobilization to violence. Drawing on the expertise of a variety of departments and agencies, the U.S. government has revamped support to community partners who can help to prevent individuals from ever reaching the point of committing terrorist violence. The U.S. government will strengthen domestic terrorism prevention resources and services. For the first time, the Department of Homeland Security, the DHS, has designated domestic violent extremism as a national priority area within the department's Homeland Security Grant Program, which means that over $77 million will be allocated to state, local, tribal, and territorial partners to prevent, protect against, and respond to domestic violent extremism. DHS and FBI are working to strengthen local prevention, threat assessments, and threat management frameworks. The Department of Defense, DoD, is incorporating training for service members separating or retiring from the military on potential targeting of those with military training by violent extremist actors. The U.S. government will improve public awareness of federal resources to address concerning or threatening behavior before violence occurs. The U.S. government will augment its efforts to address online terrorist recruitment and mobilization to violence by domestic terrorists through increased information sharing with the technology sector and the creation of innovative ways to foster digital literacy and build resilience to recruitment and mobilization. The United States also recently joined the Christchurch Call to Action to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online, an international partnership between governments and technology companies that works to develop new multilateral solutions to eliminating terrorist content online while safeguarding the freedom of online expression. Pillar number 3, disrupt and deter domestic terrorism activity. The work of federal law enforcement, as well as our state, local, tribe, and territorial law enforcement partners, is critical to countering domestic terrorism. The U.S. government will increase support to federal, state, and local law enforcement in addressing domestic terrorism nationwide. U.S. attorneys' offices and FBI field offices across the country have formally made domestic terrorism a top priority and are tracking comprehensively domestic terrorism-related cases, reallocating or requesting appropriate funding and resources as needed to target the threat. That includes over $100 million in additional resources for the DOJ, the FBI, and the DHS included in the President's fiscal year 2022 budget to ensure that the federal government has the analysts, investigators, prosecutors, and other personnel and resources it needs to thwart domestic terrorism and do justice when the law has been broken. State, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement will have access to increased intelligence sharing and training on domestic terrorism and associated threats. DOJ is closely examining whether new legislative authorities that balance safety and the protection of civil liberties are necessary and appropriate. The U.S. government is improving employee screening to enhance methods for identifying domestic terrorists who might pose insider threats. The Office of Personnel Management will consider updates to the forms used to apply for sensitive roles in the federal government that could assist investigators in identifying potential domestic terrorism threats. The Department of Defense, Department of Justice, and Department of Homeland Security are similarly pursuing efforts to ensure domestic terrorists are not employed within our military or law enforcement ranks and improve screening and vetting processes. Training and resources will be developed for state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement partners, as well as sensitive private sector partners to enable them to enhance their own employee screening programs and prevent individuals who pose domestic terrorism threats from being placed in positions of trust. Pillar number 4, confront long-term contributors to domestic terrorism. Every component of the government has a role to play in rooting out racism and bigotry and advancing equity for all Americans. The U.S. government, in close partnership with civil society, will address the long-term contributors that are responsible for much of today's domestic terrorism. This includes reducing and protecting Americans from racial, ethnic, and religious hatred, and stemming the flow of firearms to individuals intending to commit acts of domestic terrorism. We will work to ensure that law enforcement operates without bias in countering domestic terrorism, and provide for the public safety of all Americans in a true democracy. Violence cannot be an acceptable mode of seeking political or social change in the United States. The U.S. government is committed to strengthening trust in American democracy and its ability to deliver for the American people including through relief and opportunity provided by the American Rescue Plan, the American Jobs Plan, and the American Families Plan. The U.S. government will also work to find ways to counter the polarization often fueled by disinformation, misinformation, and dangerous conspiracy theories online, supporting an information environment that fosters healthy, democratic discourse. In implementing this strategy and at the direction of President Biden, we will remain focused on addressing violence and reducing the threat of violence while vigilantly safeguarding peaceful expression of a wide range of views and freedom of political association. That is directly from the White House and instituted by President Joe Biden. Fellow Americans, this is the directive from the White House of the United States of America. Keep in mind that if we ever elect a president who doesn't believe in what this document states, the first thing that person will do is change the directives to all the departments that have any influence and redirect them on whatever he or she may decide will be the destiny of the country. We have to be mindful. We have to make sure that we elect a president who will guide us in the right direction. I'm Juan Andres. You can find us on more than 60 sites on the internet where you can listen to our podcast. Just ask Google, Radio Labio, and bingo will show up. On my behalf, as well as my colleague Ivan Encinas and our manager and fellow on-air personality Francisco Maldonado, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.